Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Auxiliary Markings Club, our first Zoom meeting. We're very honored tonight to have Gordon Smith with us, and he's going to be speaking on his very interesting typologies he's developed for his collecting. Gordon is, and I have to add this because I'm one as well, a proud Canadian. He's been collecting the stamps and postal history of Botswana since he lived there in the late 1900s and early 2000s. Despite the high volumes of mail being franked with meter markings in the country, he realized that no one was collecting these marks or recording the history of their use. So he decided to focus his collecting efforts on this material. He's developed a detailed typology of these marks and exhibited the material and information at local, national, and international shows. He's also written extensively about the topic. Gordon's work with meter marks quickly expanded to an interest in other non-stamped forms of mail in Botswana, including official free marks, permit mail, and registration marks. He has developed typologies and written many articles about these marks as well. He has created an exhibit on Botswana official free marks that he's shown at local and national shows. Gordon has a website, which I hope he'll share the information about, called postalhistory.ca, that contains information about many of these and other topics, where people can also find copies of the articles and presentations. So Gordon, we're thrilled to have you, and without further ado, we'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Greg. I'll just share my screen. And how's that? Everybody can see that okay? Great. Okay, so we called this Typologies, a personal approach to classification and lessons learned on the development of typologies and cataloging through the collecting of the non-stamp postal history of Botswana. So Greg had given us a bit of an introduction about that. So the things that I collect, and again, Greg mentioned that, there's meter marks, official free marks, registration labels, permit labels, and on Botswana government service and different pieces like that. I don't know why I have a particular interest in things that have moved through the mail, not necessarily with stamps on them. So these are just some images of the things that I collect. I currently live in Nova Scotia. As Greg mentioned, I lived in Botswana from 1994 to 2002. I had a private consulting company there that I started to work for and eventually ended up owning. I was the typical story of most people collecting stamps. I collected stamps as a kid, lost an interest when I was in high school, and then my interest was reignited when I moved to Botswana and I started getting nicely stamped mail from family in Canada. This was the pre-internet days, so you still had to write letters, or I did a lot of business operations by fax, which was interesting, which we don't use at all anymore, really, I think. I joined a local club there and started collecting Botswana stamps. I quickly got a very good collection of stamps. They have a very conservative stamp issuing policy, maybe 4 issues of 4 stamps a year. So it's pretty easy to collect. But to start or continue collecting things from Botswana, you'd have to move into errors or freaks or oddities or other things, and it would get very expensive very fast. So I started looking at other things, and meter marks attracted my attention. Again, as Greg mentioned, because nobody was collecting them, and I could also pick up the stuff for free. Mostly, I also had a deal with a medical aid society mail room where I'd go in every 2 weeks with 2 cans of Coke and come out with about a 6 cubic foot box full of envelopes that I could sort through and things like that. So that's how I was collecting many of these things. So in terms of cataloging this material, I currently have probably closer to 4,000 covers of non-stamp postal history from Botswana. If I didn't have my background up, you'd see the wall behind me, which is just a row of boxes that has all the material in it. And even in the early days, I was having trouble keeping track of what I owned, and I was often buying duplicates. And so I needed to figure out some system to record what I had. I started using Excel, but I didn't find its ability to sort really good. I then started using FileMaker Pro in the early 2000s, which was an Apple product, but technical support and updates started to dwindle there. And then when I moved back to Canada, I moved from an Apple world to a PC world, and Microsoft Access became available to me. So this chart, and it might be a little hard to see because it's big, but this is how I organize my material. And I'll get into it in more detail about each particular topic. But if you see across the top there, I have what I call dominant mark. So I kind of had to decide what was my primary interest when I was looking at something. So my strong interest was and still remains meter marks. But then if it maybe it's not very often you get a meter mark and an official free mark, that wouldn't happen, but that was kind of my secondary interest. But sometimes I could get meter marks on government printed envelopes, which is column 3, or all the time, almost 99.9% of the time, official free marks are on government printed envelopes. And then all those 3 topics there could have registration labels, and then permit mail was something that I started collecting later on. And so what I do is when I look at a cover, I go, okay, it's a meter mark, so I'm going to use this system. Oh, official free, so I'll use this system, or however I go through. And then under those, there's different ways that I determine groups, types, and varieties of each of these things. And I'll get into those in more detail when I get into the different items. So just talking about meter marks here. I've put this up because I talk about many of these things when I'm doing my typology. So there's the indicium or indicia, the frame, what's the prefix, license number is important, the value and the format of that value is important, date stamps, town marks, and settings, and things like that. So just these are things that I use to determine the different types that I'm looking at. So if I look at this, on the left-hand side of the screen is the breakdown. That's the lower part that was on that first screen that showed all the 5 types. So I look at basic shape. So if we look on the right side, you can see, oh, well, they're square, or they're rectangular, or they don't have lines around them, or they have they look like they've been perforated or whatever. So it's just, but that's just kind of a look at it, and okay, it's this kind. And then the type, you can have the same types, and then it's size of indicia, size of the setting, which is the space between the town mark or the circle and the indicium, which is a square, the frame style, inscription wording. And then when I want to get really into this, differences in the styles of the circles forming the town mark. So are they broken or not? Is there 1 or 2? Is there text in the bottom of that town mark? What's the value format? So you can see on the right side, some have like what looks like an equal sign, some don't have decimal points, and things like that. Positioning of the inscription, so that's the words that are in the indicia or indicium. Where are they located? So you can see type 18A1, there's only words on the top and bottom, but if you look at 20, there's words on 3 sides of it. And type 10A2, there's words on 4 sides. Date layout and date size and text and things like that. Text bolding and sizing are other things that kind of help me to do this. So looking at this, I've got a table here that shows type 1 or group 1, and then we get into the types. And so the things that determine that was that top box on the one previous slide. And so you can see size of the indicia. So you can look at the ones on the right here. So this, the bottom indicia is slightly smaller than the top 2. So that makes it a different type because it's a B type. If I look at types 1A1 and 1A2, what makes them different varieties, they're the same type because the things that determine type are the same. It's the format of the value that makes them a different variety. So then what I've done is just put that in there. And what I do is just to make it easier to read, I color the differences different colors. So you can look across this very quickly and determine the first one, everything's yellow, but then the second one, oh, it's that orange thing that's different. Oh, and then here in the third line, It's these things on the right hand or left hand side that make it a little bit different, and then the variety is different in the later parts. So what I do is I use, as I was mentioning, Microsoft Access, and I've set up a database with these. And I like this better than, say, Excel, because I just find it a more powerful way to sort and to also look at things. So in this example that I've got here, I've clicked on this S1, and it automatically shows me what I own if I look at that by clicking on the plus or minus sign on the side. Takes a little bit of time to set up and to think about. Establishing this first typology for me, it probably took me about 4 years to work it out, mostly because I had young children, and the only time I had time to think about it was on my ferry ride into work. So I'd have 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening, and then the rest of the time was taken up with looking after kids. But I would take a few sheets of paper with me and think about it and play around with it a little bit as I rode the ferry back and forth across. And then I started to create this database, and I would have different tables and ways I could put in information and link them so that I can sort them in different ways. So the next thing I was looking at was Botswana official free marks. This is just an example there. So it's this on Botswana government service across the top here. That's the next one. It's this mark that says Unified Local Government Service official free. So in Botswana, they still have the ability, if you're a government department, armed forces, public school, hospitals, different sort of public services like that, that you can send mail through or send mail for free. But what you need to have on it is what department you are and the term official free. Has to be printed on the hand stamp that you would have. It's interesting because the only rules that exist is that those two things. Has to say official free, you have to have the department on it. So you can get a huge variety of marks.
Wow.
Like there's all these different shapes and pieces like that. So this is very challenging to sort and get a typology. But what I did was look at this, where there's the item, and then is it a multi-line or a straight line? So if we were to go back to the previous slide, like this would be a multi-line, on the top, in the middle, on the top, and then single line or whatever would be the next two down. They would be the ones that are straight lines. And then the next piece of it that would divides them into groups after I've got those categories is the shape. So are they rectangles, ovals, or circles? If I'm going down the multi-line one, below the straight line one, are they boxed or not? Like, so there's no box, there's a line above and below, there's a full box, or there's actually an oval around a single line word. Then to get down into types is the outer border. So is there 1, 2, or 3 outer borders? Are they all the same thickness, or is 1 or 2 different sizes? Are there interior lines? So sometimes there might be no interior lines, 1 interior line, or 2 interior lines. On the straight line ones, I use dimensions. So how wide are they and how tall are they? And then to get down into the varieties, there's the users, dimensions, location, and text can kind of differentiate amongst them, because you could have the same user and sometimes they have different official free marks that are slightly different sizes. In the straight line ones, color is one of the things, and the user would be the differentiation there. So if we just go back for a moment here, like we look at this one here. So, there's with the piece in the middle and the circles and 2 lines, this one's official free. It's got the box around it. This is the lower left, and it's got kind of 3 oval lines around it and text in different places. So you can see how there's just that huge variety of what they look like. So the table on the right hand side is how I kind of split them out and give them a code, because I need a code or something to put into my database to say, okay, what kind is this? I only go to the type level because every official free mark is basically its own variety when I get through this. So with that complication, as people look at these, and if they try to use this, they need to look at visual examples. They can't just understand it from the code. And the coding is kind of a shorthand description. So if you're talking to somebody, you could say, oh, I've got a Princess Marina Hospital. It's an OS 0N type. So the way this works is the group, like using the top line here, the first one, it's multi-line, it's a rectangle. And then you have the option of none, no outer borders or single borders. And if I look over here, that's what determines the first part of the code. So rectangle is R, none is N, or the second line on the right-hand side, rectangle single, so RS. And then the number of lines, interior 0, 1, 1 partial, 2 both doubled. So those kind of give the next piece of information there. So if I look at that top code again, it's got 0 interior lines. So it's RN0. And then lots of them have stars on them for some reason. So do they have stars or not? And that gives us the last letter of the code. So that would be an N. We get some little variations here where we get 1 partial line to differentiate it from 1 line. So that's an RS1P, and or 2 doubled lines, that's a 2 both doubled N is the way it's done. So people can look through this and use the codes. If I go down to the straight line ones that are on the bottom, it's just like no border, and then it's the dimensions, or it's line over and under, which is an L, and then the dimensions. So it's the dimensions are the things that differentiate those. Interestingly, on the oval one, I would have just started with an O, but if we look at the multi-line ones, there's an O code there, so I just put an S in front of it for straight line ovals. So here's an example of the database for that. On the second column from the left is the type. So this is a straight line type at the top there. It's boxed, so it's got the B and then it's got the dimensions. Then I list the department, which is basically everything that's written in the mark, and then the location and things like that. So this allows me to sort by department, or I can sort by type to see different types, or I can just sort straight by dimensions and things like that if I want to look at it. I also tend to put in locations. So again, I can sort by locations if I want to think about, oh, what's everything that came from Gaborone or Maun or Francistown or a place like that. Government printed envelopes. So this is the one where it says on Botswana government service across the top. I do collect some stuff with stamps. So this one has a stamp on it, but often they don't. They often have those official free marks. I got into this because there was a person, 2 people who had written a book about official forms and official envelopes and things from Botswana, and they wanted me to talk about these types of envelopes in particular because they hadn't written about them. And so this, if I look at categories, the first way is what's the lettering actually across the top. So on Botswana government service, on Botswana postal service. So those were the terms that were used after independence in 1966. Previous to that, they had official envelopes that said on Her Majesty's service or on His Majesty's service. On government service is also a more current one. And then we have OHMS, which is just shorthand for on Her or His Majesty's service. OHMS-ID VHHW, that's Afrikaans is the second set of letters, and I couldn't tell you what they mean, but Botswana is right next door to South Africa, and up until 1966, all the administration for the country and the governance was done out of Mafeking, which is a town in South Africa. So even though it was a separate country, the government rested in another country, which was kind of interesting. And then I've included telegram envelopes in looking at these officially sort of printed envelopes. Then looking at grouping, that's based, is there a logo printed on the envelope? So sometimes on the back, on the flap, there'll be an envelope. Is the writing underlined? Is it serif? What's the case? Is it all uppercase? Is it all lowercase? Or is it upper and lowercase mixed? Type goes into style of font and boldness of the text. And then variety is size of the setting. So how long is the mark? You measure that, and what's its color. So the challenge with this was that these weren't really printed officially. I think government just would put out contracts, or different departments of government would put out contracts to local printers, or if they were in a different town, they would just get the local printer to print them. So there's a huge variety of these as well. I was hoping to get, to a fairly simplified version of this, but it's not possible. So the way that I type these is I assign a prefix to them, which is based on what the lettering is. So OBGS on Botswana Government Service, OBPS is on Botswana Postal Service, Her Majesty's Service, things like that. And then group is based on, are they underlined? So there's a U or an N ends up in the code, a serif. S is serif, SS is sans serif, so no serifs on the font, and case is the capitalization. And then I assign a type, which is a number given on the sequence of discovery. So if we looked at some examples of these, on the left-hand side at the top, on Botswana Government Service, that's OBGS, and it's type underlined. Geez, I got to go back and look at this now because it's been a while since I've looked at it. So it's underlined, sans serif, and upper and lower case. Did I get that right? So this is, yeah, so this font here, it's hard to see, but it actually does have slight serifs if you were to go in. This one's much more clear with the serifs. And then that number is just when have I found them. Here's one that is sans serif, so it's on Botswana Government Service again, no underline, sans serif. It's all uppercase, and then just the first one I found, variety and color here on the bottom one and things like that. So this just shows again on an envelope kind of how we do it. So the imprint text is underlined, it's a serif font, it's all uppercase. First one I saw, so it's a US U1. And again, kind of the database here. You'll see on here on the extreme left-hand side, there's an accession number. So to find these things, I needed to figure out some way of numbering them so I could file them and go find them after I looked at something in my database. So I would assign an accession number, and I'll get into that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. But just for the official free marks, I used this start of its BOFM, Botswana official free mark, and then they're just numbered sequentially as I find them, and I just file them that way. And then I've got in here what the inscription is, the setting, setting widths and different information. I was at one point trying to separate them based on paper types, but again, there's just so many paper types that didn't really make sense. I've got dates and things like that again, so I can compare if I want to according to date. Registration labels, so that's the label that's on the left-hand side of this image. And the way I look at it, all of the registration labels are they a label that you stick on? Is it a hand stamp? Is it manuscript? I haven't kind of finished developing a typology for the hand stamps or the manuscripts. I'm still thinking about that one, but I've gone through and done the labels, and actually it was based on a typology that two people had, Sir John Infield Watson and some of his colleagues had developed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where you can see there's on the table or the chart on the right-hand side, it's a D4, D3 or D4, D4. The way that's done is based on what's the R font, what does it look like, what's the office name font, so you can see Celebi Piquet or Gaborone 3 or Gaborone 1, what's the font of the number, and there's like a sans serif font. If you look below the second one from the top on the left-hand side on that table, you can see there's a serif number, and the 0 has a little dot under it. You go down a couple more, there's a number with an underline under it, so different things there. And then the serial number font. So how big is it? Is it serif, sans serif? What kind of style is it? And then I added sort of variety based on location, because you can have labels that look exactly the same, but come from different offices. This one I have in Excel. I haven't exported it over to Microsoft Access yet. You can see some accession numbers there. And again, you'll see there's an RL, so that means it's registration label. I give it a 4-letter code based on the office it's from, and then I just number them sequentially as I find them. And then I've got the codes in here of the different pieces. I also put in the registration numbers just as another way to keep track of them. And I also track not necessarily things that I have, but what other people have. And that's what these codes kind of tell on the side here, is who owns them, or are they in a book or something, their journal that I've seen. You can see in here there's Botswana official free mark. So there's a Botswana official free mark that had a registration label on it. Here's an OBGS, so that's on Botswana government service envelope that had a mark on it. So why this accession number is important is it tells me where I've filed it, because I file things in order of that sequence of that first slide I showed you. So if it's a meter mark, that takes priority. If it's an official free mark, that has priority over it having a registration label. But if I look in my registration label database and I want to find that cover, I know, oh, go look for it in this box, not that box, because that's a bit of the challenge when you have the different marks on it that you're interested in. Permit mail. So these are just permits. They get assigned a number, but there are some specifications on what the mark needs to look like. But what I do is I group them according to their permit number, and then I differentiate, are they printed, are they a hand stamp, or are they printed on a label? And then the varieties are colors, the fletching characteristics. So the fletch are the kind of the wings on the side of the circle. So is it curved or angular? How spaced are they? What's their boldness? What's the overall size of the imprint? So sometimes they can be smaller or larger, font size and boldness of the circles and lines. So my conundrum, as I was saying, is one cover, multiple marks. So if we look at this cover, it's got 3 different things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the registration label, I'm interested in the on Botswana government service, and I'm interested in the official free mark. So I had to figure out how to store and retrieve these things. So that's this accession numbering system I set up. This is that chart that I showed you at the start, and it goes by priority, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across the top. Whatever it is, whatever the first thing I hit is, that's what takes priority in terms of creating an accession number for it and how I file it. So this is the examples of how it works. So meters, I prefix the accession number with BMM, Botswana meter mark, and then it's the license number, the prefix, and date. And if there's same dates, I add sequential numbers. So the example there is BMM-096. So 096 is the license number. The prefix is R, because they had different prefixes on the meter marks. And then there's the date there. And then if there's a sequential, like I've got an A there because I might have 2 or 3 that are on that same day for something like that one company sent out on the same day. So they'd just be A, B, C at the end. Another one here, BMM 06526. That's the license number. BP is the prefix, and then just the date. Official freeze, sequential numbering. So Botswana official free mark 056, government printed envelopes. The sequential acquisition number, registration labels. I put RL, registration label, and then actually I've noticed that this is in terms of filing them, which is different from coding them. I give them this 4-letter piece and then the sequential acquisition number. And then permit number is just PM, the permit number, and then the sequential number of as I've acquired them. And I guess I use those sequential numbers for those ones because often they don't have dates on them. They just have the mark and they haven't been postmarked, so you don't know what the date was. So my lessons learned about all this was I built this as I went, not really knowing where it was going. I built the metadatabase first, and then I've added official freeze and government printed envelopes into the databases. And I thought about each cover separately and created a separate database for each. The problem with that is I've got duplicates of information in 2 different databases. It would have been better just to have the system kind of set up, give it an accession number, and have that certain information associated with the cover and just associate with the accession number and that, and then I could call that into my other databases. So I would only have to put data in once. Sometimes I have to put data in 3 times into 3 different databases, and that allows errors to start to creep in. I like having the prefixes, so I'd have to think about that a little bit more because it tells me about the primary interest of the cover. If I'm looking at it, or I'm, it's a Botswana meter mark or it's a Botswana official free, I file by those types. So it makes it easier to find and kind of keeps them in a little bit better order. And if I'm just interested in looking at my meter marks, I can just go look at them. I've got them all filed together. So that's really kind of the highlights of kind of how I do it. I'm happy to answer questions now or anytime in the future if people are trying to do this. I've put my email there, Gordon or gs@postalhistory.ca. And then on my website, as Greg mentioned at the start, postalhistory.ca, I've got all this information on the different sort of typologies and pieces and information about other things I collect. So you're very welcome to go have a look at that site. And again, there's a contact page there. So if you can't remember my email address, you can go onto the contact page and send me a note there. And I get an email about that and can, we can start up some correspondence on that. So that's, I'll stop sharing for now, and I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Gordon. That's fascinating stuff. I don't know about anybody else that collects auxiliary markings, but my greatest fear is that I will have this endlessly wandering kind of assortment of things, and you just lose things. I mean, I still find things that I didn't actually know I had. So Gordon was very kind to give me some time a couple of months ago after an RPSC, Royal Philatelic Society of Canada presentation, and it's already started to help me organize my collection. So he's very generous with his time and with his willingness to impart what he's learned in his own pursuit of this. So does anybody have any questions? Douglas?
This is Jerry. Microsoft Access is a relational database. So with all that, did you also store images within Microsoft Access of the covers?
I didn't. What I've done is I've stored some. My meter marks, for some reason, I never got around to scanning them yet. But my official freeze and things, I've scanned them and I have them just in a file folder with their accession number. Yeah. So I can just go find that sure. way. I was thinking it would be really cool to store the images in the database. Just haven't gotten around to it.
Mm-hmm. Douglas, did you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Yeah, that was a very thought-provoking talk. And having spent the last 20 years thinking about auxiliary markings, the challenge of cataloging these things has become quite daunting. And I think your observation about multiple features on a single cover is a critical one, because so often you pick up a cover and you're fascinated by one thing, and later on it turns out you're actually holding the only auxiliary marking of that type you've ever seen. And being able to find them again is something I'm always struggling with. I think your conclusion at the end that having a single system, you know, if you're starting from scratch, makes a lot of sense. And certainly with auxiliary markings, it's alleged there are millions of them. One does have to have a coherent plan, not come up with different ones for everything. So my first question is, if I were to hand you a cover with a couple of markings on, a couple of different features of interest to you, how long would it take you to enter it into the database?
5 minutes, maybe not even that, probably less
Okay.
than 5, because what I'm doing is just pulling certain information. So if I knew, like, what takes time is like determining the type of the mark, right? Like, so if I was looking at an official freeze, I've kind of got to go through the system and say, oh, this is an RSO0N or whatever, and then look at other types and see, do I have that or not, and things like that. That's what takes time, is just figuring that out and figuring out if it's a new mark or not. So that can take a little bit of time. But what I tend to do when I've got a batch of covers I'm putting in is I do all that and I just write in pencil on the cover what the type of mark is, and then I can go through and I can probably put a cover in less than a minute. But it takes a few minutes to look at it and, oh, this is what it is and this is the type. Figure that out. Is it a new one? And if it is, then I have to go into my overall database and add that as a new type, right? Like, those are the things that take time. But if I know what it is and I just have to input data on the cover, I can probably put in a cover in 30 seconds.
So then the other half of it is, particularly in the case of a club where we have many members and all of whom are interested in, you know, do they have a new cover, that kind of thing. Having it something which is easily accessible to the person who didn't, excuse me, to the person who didn't invent the system is critical. It seems to me naively that one advantage we have is we're looking basically at text markings. And my inclination has been to figure you just alphabetize a list. Excuse me. So that way you look at the marking starting at the top, return to sender, address unknown. And you can then jump to an alphabetical list of return to sender, address unknown, and see if you then are within one of the varieties. The thing that gets really tricky there is, what if it's a list with 10 choices? The first choice is address unknown, but this particular one is unclaimed at the very bottom of the list. So do you want to list it by the first thing on the printed mark, or do you list it by the one that got checked off, or do you cross list it, which I think is probably what you have to do, so that the same identical marking always appears in one place, and you then have a pointer to the fact that in this particular instance, it was the last choice that was marked off, not the first.
Yeah, because how it's marked is probably as important. But maybe you have, like, if it's a common hand stamp that has 8 choices in it, I would tend to list the stamp as a thing.
Yep.
Okay, so I go and I look at the stamp, and then its a variety is based on what's checked, right? Like, so it's like, that would be another differentiator. So if I was looking at the cover, I'd go, oh, it's this, I can't remember the word you use there, but it's this hand stamp, and then it's got 4 or 5 choices, and it's this one was ticked. It would be a separate piece on it.
Oh, that's very nice. Yes, because that also solves the problem that maybe this particular exact hand stamp's been seen 100 times, but this is the first instance of that box ever getting checked. And it's not that it's a new stamp, it's a new usage. Yep. Very nice.
And that kind of gives you so there's 100, that's what would differentiate it to me, which would make it easier to find or to and you could go down as deep as you want to go. Then in a way, you could stop at just, oh, it's just got the hand stamp, or it's got the hand stamp with this checked.
Right. Okay. So I guess I see that Tom is on, who worked a lot on this earlier. I think the last challenge, besides getting 140 people to enter data into one database, or provide data for one database, then the ability for them to find things quickly, it's sort of the two sides of the coin. And those have been the challenges that we've been struggling with.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look because there's a pretty good book, and I'd like to find it again. I can't remember where I put it on my website right now, but it came from the Bechuanalands and Botswana Society, and they had done a typology of a large sort of number of postmarks, and then also these auxiliary markings from Botswana. And I thought it was a pretty good starting point to think about. What I'll do is I'll look it up and find it, and then I will I can send that link to Greg, who can share it with you folks as a way to look. I've got it on my website. I just can't remember where I put it.
Right.
My issue is that this is Peter Reichard. Can you hear me?
Yep, no problem.
Okay. I've been tasked with sort of organizing the new catalog, and have put out pleas to other people to give me information here. But when somebody wants to look up something in a catalog, for example, in the pointing hand issue, there's a bazillion of them. And this, as opposed to the return to sender address unknown with 8 check marks, the design of the pointing hand is there's 1,000 of them. And it has to be reduced. You can't have 1,000 of them. You can't say there's 1,000 different ones. Nobody will be able to look up at in a new catalog and find and say, is this one of these? So I'm looking for new methods, and that's why I'm watching this particular presentation, is how do we come up with those kinds of things? One of the other issues that's sort of been brought up already by Douglas was how do people enter data? And I think the answer is going to have to be that we don't have 140 some people entering data into the catalog. We have a group of catalogers, 8 or 9 people or something, some number that we can sucker into doing this. So that when somebody says, I believe I have a new marking, it can be sent to the catalog group or to me or to someone in particular, who can then try to determine how to fit it into the catalog, what the categorization is, and to make the actual entry. So I'm looking at what you're doing and I'm going, no, I can't do that for what we're doing here. It's going to be insane.
I think, like, as a thought, because it's insane with the different kind of marks that are there, and I for like on Botswana government service and things like that. But maybe there's like types of hands, right? Like when I think about it, is the cuff solid or open, or is there a button on the cuff, or what are other obvious things about that? And could you take those, and again, like, you can let people dig down as deep as they want, right? Like, so here's all the hands that have solid cuff, right? And then they just, oh, is it that kind? And then beneath that, there would be subtypes if they want it, or is this a pointing hand that's got, the thumb pointing up, I don't know, or the thumb pointing down, right? Like, I'm not that familiar enough with the marks to be able to give you a good example of that, but that might be a way to kind of take that 1,000 and get it into 20. And then under those 20, there's, some subtypes, right? That let it go further. And that's also why, like, on the Botswana meter marks, I developed, like, there's type, right? Like, and so that's pretty simple. And unless you want to go way down the rabbit hole, like I've done, you can just go by types and say, is this a serrated edge or not? Or is it a square edge one? You don't have to get into, where's the decimal point in the value necessarily. You know, so that might be another way to just think about it that would help with that sorting of those. But that piece takes time, is to think about what are the characteristics of these things that would differentiate them. Like that's what took me time with the meter marks, I spent a lot of time looking at what do I think makes these things different, and what's the big things that make them different, and the little things. And again, it was a visual assessment. So it's, again, with the pointing hands, I don't know if you sort of laid out a whole bunch of covers on the thing. Is it possible just to kind of go, oh, these look similar, so I'll make a pile of those, and these ones kind of look similar, so there's another pile, and then these look similar, and then to say, okay, what makes this pile than this pile? You know, because it's very much a visual thing.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense then to also put the image in, because initially, if somebody wasn't thinking about buttons, they would have all these pointing fingers, hands, half of which have buttons, half of which do not have buttons, and they would have put them all together. And then somebody notices the buttons and realizes that's a really obvious split. And, you know, I think if you do size, direction, color, cuff, button, fingernails being marked or not marked, let's say, so that's, say, 6 different dimensions, and you flip them on or off, you get a lot of permutations. But when you go down the tree, you very quickly differentiate them. And it's quite easy. If somebody's quick and dirty, they throw it in, say, pointing left. And then when the time comes, we look at the buttons, the sleeves, and the fingernails, and you can dig it as deep as you want or as shallow as you want.
There's a difference between, if you will, us categorizing this material and creating the catalog, and the person trying to use the catalog to say, is my pointing hand already here? And if that organization is too complex, then they're going to have a hard time finding their particular pointing hand that might be right there, and might be to one of us as a cataloger instantly, oh yes, we have that, it's right there. But it's not going to be instantly obvious or findable by someone using the catalog. Yes, the pictures have to be there, but explaining how we've categorized the pointing hand just by itself, so that someone can use that categorization to look up their pointing hand, I'm leery that we will ever come up with a methodology to do that.
It might be useful to do what Gordon did at the beginning of each one of the sections that he had tonight, for things like pointing hands, for, you know, return to sender, registered mail, whatever, to basically say, here's the way we arrange this group. We start with the direction, we move to, you know, fingernails, we move to cuff, button. And so as you go down, you're actually able to search and see if yours is there. I mean, it would be an extra layer on top of the actual catalog, but showing how you've broken it out and what the dividing steps are might actually be very useful to people as they begin to search for it.
The other thing is, like, when was it first used and where? You know, because not all pointing fingers, especially in my case, where you go back into the maybe anywhere from the 1850s to 1890s, you know, they were not universally used. You know, some states did, some postmasters did, things like that. So that adds a whole nother layer into this.
Gordon, let me bring up a point here as well too, because I think some of you know, kind of done a little bit of this maybe about 20 years ago. One of the biggest problems I had, I started putting everything into Excel, including images, next to everything. I mean, it got humongous to begin with. And said, you know, the only way to do this is a relational database, i.e. Access. The problem is not everyone uses Access. Not everyone, if you don't have Access or a relational database, how do you make this information available to the people who want to see what's available? What have you found? Do I have something new?
Yep. So the way I've done it is I print out my typologies as PDFs and I put them up on my site, right? But I think it would be interesting, and I haven't explored this, is could you create like an interface on a website or something where people could follow that a little bit more easily, and be able to put in information in some way if they want it. Yeah, like I'm not sure, like the relation of the databases are for me, and they work for me. I haven't thought about how do I make this available as a sort of fully sortable database to others. I'm not sure, excuse me. I know for in access, again, like if I wanted to provide people, or I can create forms that limit what people can put in, right? Like, so they can't get into the back end of it. They only can kind of get into the front end, and that gives some quality assurance. So again, maybe if it was like the Auxiliary Marking Club was doing it, maybe there's a, and I haven't looked at it in a particular way, but there's a way that it can provide access to access for people who are responsible for putting the database together, right? And I lease, like I pay, that's less than $10 a month, and I have Microsoft 365, which gives me access and a terabyte of storage on the web. Because I ran out, 100 megabytes wasn't enough, so I needed a terabyte on the web. So I just coughed up the money because I wanted access and I wanted that. So it's $120 a year, which for me is okay value. I recognize that's a lot of money out there for other people, but it seemed to be a reasonable way to kind of get it. So again, I think it's not that it's a $500 or $600 piece of software you have to buy. You can kind of amortize your costs by paying $10 a month.
But the user or the person who's trying to get that information out of the system has to at least be a little comfortable with that application as well. And that's a bit of a learning curve, I think, for most people.
Yeah, like again, it would be an interesting thing to think about. Is there fundamental questions you might ask that would get people down to a certain type? And then it's primarily a visual hobby. So like, could you set it up on a website? Like your first question, is it a hand stamp or you know, in a box or a pointing hand? And then some other questions that get you down to where, okay, here's a 40-page document just about pointing hands, right? With buttons. You know,
I'm not sure if it was the I'm not sure if it was the Cancellation Club, US Cancellation Club, that had that on their website. Literally, that was it. It would ask a series of maybe about 5 basic questions first to at least get you through a first sort.
Yeah.
And then that information was available on a specific page. Much smaller, to a smaller degree than a project like this, but that's exactly how they worked it. They asked some basic questions first, sort that out, and then take you to a page that kind of lists for them everything that met your criteria.
Yeah.
Oh, Douglas. Douglas. He's our webmaster. So the question is, what can we do?
Well, we have SQL, which is another database. SQL is available for free on our website and essentially unlimited storage. So, and I think things can be moved between databases with more expertise than I have, but we could probably find a way. But I do think that in principle, if we had a way for the naive user to go to a user-friendly thing, such as the US Cancel Club was mentioned, and I think the critical thing would be you ask a series of questions, just like identifying birds in a bird book. You ask a series of questions, you go down the tree, and the critical point, I think, is that you give the option of I don't know. So if it asks the question, are there buttons on the sleeve for a pointing hand, which is, you know, kind of diagnostic, but maybe the person doesn't know for some reason. Maybe that part of it's blurry or something. So if you always have the option at every step of saying I don't know, what that is equivalent to is checking both boxes, yes and no. And that way you can pass down the system as a naive user and answer only the questions you know the answers to. And it still is probably going to get you pretty close.
And I think the other thing, like I find, like I think I tend to put up my information as PDFs, right? Because it's a visual thing, and it's less effort for me to do that work in Word or Excel or PowerPoint to create that PDF than it is to go in and alter my website. Because I can create the PDF and then just upload that. So if you got people to a certain point, and then here's a document that shows all the pointing hands of this type of what you've described, then the person can open up that PDF and kind of flip through and go, oh, there, I'm on that. That's the one I've got, right? And they only have to look through maybe 100 examples rather than 1,000, right, to find out what it is. And so I think there's maybe ways to think about that. And if they got, with your example, Doug, maybe they get 2 documents that open up because they answered I don't know at some point. And so the sort leads them to the 2 PDFs, and they have to look through both.
I think I have to just look at what I see people doing, what I do. I've got a lot of computer background myself, so
Yeah.
it's not like I'm naive here.
Yeah.
But I think what's going to happen with the catalog, we put the catalog online, and I think what people are going to end up doing is scrolling through the whole catalog. So, which isn't bad. It just, when you get to something where there's 1,000 examples, if you will, it's just going to take them forever. And so I think we really need to have that ability to do queries against the database and hopefully give them a subset. The question is, how do you present that subset when there could be 200 subsets of the data, of all the data that are out there, even in a less dense form? You can't produce 200 PDFs and then when somebody adds 10 things to the database, reproduce 200 PDFs. It's just not, it's not practical in the environment that we're in. I could probably use a team of programmers to do that, but I can't do that here.
Yeah. What about, so there's a wiki book for the International Meter Stamp Catalog. Now, it does its initial sort by country, but then there's different sorts under that. And it's a wiki book, which is kind of interesting. That's my only experience of it. And again, that might be just something interesting to look at. Is there a way to do that? I don't know that its front end's got a searchable kind of database that you could use, but it might be an interesting thing to explore. Because what they did, the authors took their hard copy book and turn it into this wiki book, and then they can update it very easily just by adding stuff to the different pages that they have in this wiki book.
And it was a wiki book for what?
International Meter Stamp Catalog.
Oh, yes, yes, right. That's huge.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's again, that might be another way to look at it. I'm not sure. Because it lets you think about it as a book, and you can have lots of different pages then, or different types of information in there. And again, if I want to, it's pretty easy for me when I look at it. If I want to scroll through a country, I can scroll through a country pretty easily. Maybe there's a way, as Pete has said, that you can scroll through a certain, like all the pointing hands if you want it, or there's a way to sort and it gets you to a more fine piece. I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. The other issue that we have to be careful of is if we produce a catalog that's downloadable, as our catalog is now, and we're now looking at putting in a lot of additional data that we haven't put into the catalog in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. That if somebody downloads the catalog and is using that, the problem becomes when we add material to the online catalog itself, and the person is looking in their copy, they come back and say, oh, I have something new or whatever, because they've looked at a dated copy. I'm used to doing this in mainframe systems and large scale systems, and I found people who were downloading a database or a chunk of a database and using it for 2 or 3 years because they never got around to downloading the new one again. And they kept telling me about the problems that were there. And I kept saying, I'd look up the online version and I'd go, no, that's not there. That's not, that's not what it looks like. And finding that they had not bothered to update themselves, they were taking an easy way out. So one of the questions that we're going to have to answer is, do we want people to download a catalog if we are hoping that they're going to add material to us? I'm sorry, Thomas is trying to talk. I'll quit.
You're on mute, Thomas.
I think he may be talking to somebody off
Oh, okay.
camera.
So I got a lot of good things out of this. I'm going to come back to several people offline. Douglas and I have got some of this and stuff. I need to talk to Thomas about what material he has. I've talked to, I'm sorry, but when you get old, the brain goes and you can't remember anything anyway. One of his collaborators who's now in a wheelchair, she's now in a wheelchair. I've had some back
Nancy
channel.
Clark?
Thank you. Yes, that's it. I've had some back channel with her and I'm trying to get her material. The other issue that we have right at the moment is Tony W. By the way, I just got his newest book on the New York stuff. It's really good. Gives you all where this came from, as opposed to the Chicago book from a few years ago that doesn't. I tried to ask Tony in May how much he felt of an ownership to the images that were in the current newsletter, and was there a methodology that we could get that data, the images and the description, away from him. And unfortunately, when I did that, his wife sent me back a message saying he was in the hospital with some issue. And I haven't heard from him since. So that's 2 months ago. By the way, I also got a sidebar the other day that John Hotchner had heart surgery. Do we have any clue?
Yes, I did hear back about, I think it was a week exactly after the surgery. He's home, he's doing very well. He's not traveling for 3 months on doctor's orders, but he sent an email and it sounded like he was in good shape and thinking about these things. And Tony, I remember seeing that correspondence you sent. Tony was out of the hospital a couple of days later. So it may be a matter of just reaching out again and asking the question. I don't think he's permanently laid up.
That's good. That's
Yeah, happy news on both fronts.
2 huge volumes of information are in those brains out there. And I think of a tragedy of not losing the person, but also losing all that information and stuff. So,
Yeah. All right. Well, why don't we stop there? Let me just do a commercial. If you're interested in auxiliary marks of any kind, of course, you will enjoy being part of the Auxiliary Markings Club, and you can find that at postal-markings.org. Please go to our new YouTube channel, which you no doubt will be on if you're actually watching this, and like it. And if you're on Facebook, we also have an Auxiliary Marking Club Facebook page, and we'd be delighted to have you join that as well. And thank you, Gordon, for a really thought-provoking meeting tonight and for giving us some really great ideas. It's an endless topic, and you've done a lot of thought on it and a lot of work on it, and we're really grateful for the time you shared with us.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. And again, as you're thinking about this, if you want some thoughts on something you're doing, I'm very happy to have a look over stuff and have a chat with it. And just it is a huge task, and if you've got a complicated topic, it can take a lot of time and careful thinking. And but I'm happy to help contribute if I can.
Thanks very much. All right, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.